Wyoming, late summer of 1879. On the sun-scorched ridges, the dry wind slashed across the sagebrush like the edge of a knife. Hattie Norwood tightened the cuffs of her worn leather gloves and sat firm in the saddle of her black mare Ash. She was the mistress of Norwood Creek Ranch, known in these parts as a cowgirl who shot fast and straight, a woman tall and broad-shouldered, with a steadiness that matched the land itself. Most days, past the same ride, the fence lines check the water holes, count the herd, feel the weight of bullets in the chamber, and study the circling vultures that always knew before men did when death was near. That afternoon, as the sun tipped toward the cottonwoods, Hattie spotted something unusual, a thin trail of gun smoke rising out of the dry gully of Dead Horse Creek. A crow swooped low, then bolted skyward. Ash flicked her ears. Hattie nudged her into a cautious trot, keeping low in the saddle, guiding her mare into the wash, where the rocky bottom muffled the sound of hooves. She dismounted, slid along the bank, and lifted her short spyglass. 3 figures. One lay face down, hands bound behind him. 2 others stood over him, dusters pulled tight, hats slouched low, one gripping a revolver, the other yanking the captive by the hair. Their voices carried faintly on the wind sign, "It your land, put your name down." The reply was a spit and a grunt, followed by a boot slammed into ribs. Hattie knew the pattern. Black Knoll's men. She had dealt with them before, shadows out of the played-out silver mines, now living on intimidation and forged papers. They cornered ranchers, forced signatures at gunpoint, and claimed the land as their own. Last spring, she had sent 2 of them limping back across the ridge, one with a hole in his shoulder that whistled when he breathed. She whispered to herself, steady as a prayer, "Don't shoot till the wind is yours." Hattie drew her Colt Navy from the thigh holster, rested it along the packed earth of the bank, and let her breath thin to a single line. The nearest man lifted his face, scanning the horizon. The crack of her shot split the silence. He folded as if the bones had been cut from him. The second spun, fumbling for his pistol. Hattie's wrist barely shifted. Her second round tore through the brim of his hat and smashed into his gun hand. He screamed, the revolver clattering into the dust. "Hands up," her voice was iron striking stone. The man froze, then hesitated. She squeezed the trigger half back, letting the hammer click. Dust jumped at his boots as her third bullet dug the ground. Trembling, he threw his arms overhead. Hattie rose from the bank, Colt still steady. "Face the wall. Kneel." When he obeyed, she strode to the bound figure, pulled her knife, and slashed the ropes. The man coughed hard, rolling to his side. His face was bruised, lips, split eyes, bloodshot from thirst and blows. "Name?" Hattie asked her revolver, never leaving the quivering thug. "Silas O'Doyle." His voice rasped. "They wanted me to sign, claimed I owed Black Knoll. I only worked cattle there. They never paid." He struggled upright, swaying like a pine in storm. She tipped a gourd flask to his lips. "Slow," she warned, letting him swallow a mouthful. Ash snorted above the ridge as if to remind her they had company waiting. Silas blinked, his breath uneven. "Where's the other one you shot too?" "3, Hattie cut in. "One's dead, one crippled, one still breathing barely. That leaves the coward who ran." She turned to the captive, still kneeling. "Drop the knife. Drop every iron you've got." The man threw down a blade and a derringer. "Now run. Tell your boss Norwood Creek isn't for sale. He stumbled into the brush, clutching his bleeding wrist. Hattie knelt again, binding Silas's cuts with a strip torn from her scarf. Can you stand? I'll try. He pushed himself up, managed one step before his knees buckled. She sighed through her nose, clicked her tongue at Ash, and led the mare down. Mount up. I'll hold you. Awkward shame crossed his bruised face, but her eyes held no mockery, only calm resolve. She boosted him onto the saddle, swung up behind, and looped one arm around his waist. Lean forward. Don't pass out. The mare carried them out of the wash as the sun flared red across the ridge. Quail burst from the brush, startled by the thunder of hooves. Silas rested his brow against Hattie's shoulder, heat rising from his breath. Who are you? He murmured. Hattie Norwood. Are you the law here? No. She shifted the reins, spurring Ash into a smooth lope. But the land is mine, and I don't abide their stink on it. He fell silent, head lolling as exhaustion dragged at him. For a fleeting moment, she thought of herself years ago, bruised, cornered, nearly nameless. Someone had once looked away instead of stopping. She would not. As long as she drew breath, her gun would be the hand that said no more. By the time the ranch house came into view, twilight had burned to indigo. A split log fence stretched along the slope. A low barn crouched under the pines, and smoke curled thin from the cabin chimney. Hattie slid down, steadying Silas when his knees gave out again. She half carried him to the bench under the eaves, fetched water and rags, and began to clean his wounds. Boots off, she ordered. He obeyed clumsily. I'm heavy, he muttered, embarrassed. My mare carries more than you on a bad day, she answered, blunt, as always, but her mouth twitched like the start of humor. She wrapped his cuts, set a bowl of beans and cornbread before him. He ate slowly, as though each bite might vanish if he hurried. She stood at the window, scanning the horizon. Beyond the fence, faint sparks winked in the dark. Scouts, maybe, or worse? Her fingers brushed the revolver at her thigh. They'll come back, Silas said quietly, following her gaze. They won't stop. I know. She slid the bolt across the door. But not tonight. She laid a pallet by the hearth. You sleep here. Tomorrow, we'll see if you can walk. Silas studied her face in the lamplight. No mockery, no pity, only a stillness that carried more promise than words. Why did you save me? She paused, firelight flickering across her jaw. Because once I wished someone had stopped for me. And because I hate men who think ink and cheap bullets can steal another man's name. She nodded toward him. Yours is Silas O'Doyle. And as long as you breathe under my roof, Black Knoll will have to carve their own names first. He lay back, the crackle of fire and sigh of wind filling the silence. Her shadow stretched long on the wall, hand resting easy on her gun. His voice came faint, almost to himself. If I wake tomorrow, I'll work off my debt to you. Hattie's gaze didn't shift from the flames. No one pays debt here with words. Stand tall, that's enough. The night closed around them. Coyotes wailed far off the horses, snorted in their stalls, and inside Norwood Creek Ranch, a man nearly erased from the world breathed steady once more. And Hattie Norwood, cowgirl and gunslinger, sat with her hand on her revolver like someone keeping watch over more than land, perhaps, for the first time in years, over her own chance at something different. The night stretched long. Silas dozed fitfully on the pallet by the hearth, sometimes twitching as though shadows still chased him. Hattie didn't sleep. She sat near the window, with her rifle propped across her knees, the lantern turned low, her ears tuned to every groan of timber and every shuffle of the wind through sagebrush. Out beyond the fence line, she was certain eyes watched. Black Knoll never left a matter unfinished. Toward dawn, the fire had burned low to embers. Hattie rose, tossed on fresh kindling, and stepped outside. The air was sharp cool against her face. The valley still held its night silence, but the eastern ridge glowed faint gold. Ash snorted from the corral ears flicking. Nothing moved, but she felt it, a weight pressing like the hush before a storm. Inside, Silas stirred awake with a groan. He tried to sit, then grimaced as his ribs pulled tight. "Morning," he rasped. Barely had he replied, setting a steaming cup on the table. "Drink." He pushed himself up with care, accepting the tin cup. Coffee. Chicory. Strong enough to keep you upright. He sipped, wincing at the bitterness. "You don't waste words, do you?" "Words are lighter than bullets," she said, tightening her belt and checking the chambers of her Colt. "One misses, the other doesn't." Silas managed a weak smile. "I reckon I owe you my life." Hattie turned sharply, fixing him with that cool stare. "You owe me nothing. But if you want to stay breathing, you'll need to learn this place and keep your back straight." He looked around the cabin, bare walls, shelves, lined with jars, tools, hung neat, a bedroll folded sharp as a soldier's. A woman alone, yet nothing careless. "You built all this." "Piece by piece," Hattie said, cinching her holster. "Nobody handed it to me." He didn't ask about her past. He could read enough in the lines carved by sun and silence on her face. By midday, Silas was steadier on his feet. He insisted on helping chop wood, though each swing sent pain through his ribs. Hattie watched, arms crossed, ready to stop him, but when he managed 3 solid cuts without folding, she gave a single nod. Approval from her was measured like gold dust. While he worked, she saddled Ash and rode the ridge above the ranch, scanning the horizon. Dust trails. Not many, but too straight to be wild mustangs. Riders. She descended and found Silas leaning on the axe, sweat streaking through the dust on his skin. "They're coming," she said. His jaw clenched. "For me?" "For what you know," she corrected. "But they'll burn everything to make a point." Silas exhaled hard. "You don't have to risk your land for me." Hattie's mouth curved in something like a smirk. "Too late for that." That night, she made him clean the rifles with her. His hands were clumsy but willing. She showed him how to oil the barrel, how to sight along the iron, how to keep steady even when the heart thundered. When she corrected his grip, her calloused fingers brushed his. He glanced up, surprised at her nearness. She didn't move away. "You'll need this," she said, voice low, "when the dark comes." "Dark," he echoed. "Not just night. Men who bring it with them." The next day proved her right. It was near sundown when the first shot cracked against the fence post, splintering wood. Hattie was already at the door, revolver drawn. Silas ducked low, heart pounding. 5 riders swept in from the ridge, their coats billowing, rifles glinting in the last light. Black Knoll's men. Hattie strode onto the porch, shoulders squared. "You brought the wrong fire to my land," she called. One of them laughed, spitting into the dirt. "We just came for the boy. Hand him over, and maybe your ranch still stands by morning." Silas stiffened, shame and fury warring in him. He opened his mouth, but Hattie cut him off. "You'll leave with nothing but your boots if you're lucky," she said. The hammer clicked back on her Colt, a sound sharp as the cry of a hawk. The leader sneered. "You think one woman can hold off 5 guns?" Hattie's eyes narrowed. "I don't think. I know." The silence stretched thick as thunderclouds. Then it broke. A rifle fired, grazing the porch rail. Hattie answered with a shot that dropped the rider clean out of his saddle. Chaos burst like a dam. Silas scrambled for the rifle she had set by the door. His hands shook, but training from the night before steadied him. He fired wild, but enough to force a rider to veer wide. Bullets whined splinters, flew ash reared in the corral. Hattie moved like the land itself, sure, relentless. Each shot from her Colt was measured, not wasted. A man tried to flank from the barn. She spun her coat flaring, and her bullet sent him crashing into the dirt. She reloaded smooth as breath, eyes never leaving the fight. Silas fired again, and this time his shot found flesh. The rider screamed, tumbling. Adrenaline surged hot through him. He wasn't just a beaten man anymore. He was fighting beside her. When the dust cleared, 3 men lay sprawled. The last 2 wheeled their horses and fled into the twilight, curses trailing like smoke. Silas lowered his rifle, chest heaving. He looked at Hattie. She was calm, revolver still steady, her hair wild in the wind, eyes like steel tempered by fire. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Silas said hoarsely, "You saved me again." Hattie holstered her gun. "You're not saved yet. They'll send more." She stepped closer, her voice softer, but no less firm. "If you stay, you'll have to fight with me. No running." He swallowed hard, nodding. "Then I'll fight." For the first time since he'd met her, a faint smile curved her lips, not mockery, but recognition. She clapped his shoulder once firm. "Good," she said. "Now you belong here." The stars came out over Norwood Creek that night, glittering cold against the black sky. Silas sat by the fire body, aching, but for the first time in months, his chest felt lighter. He had found not just shelter, but something fiercer, someone who stood when all others would have turned away. And Hattie Norwood, gunslinger and mistress of this land, sat across from him, cleaning her revolver by lamplight. For years, she had fought only to keep what was hers. But tonight she realized something new. For the first time, she was no longer fighting alone. Morning rose pale and cold, the kind that carried frost across the sagebrush, even while the sun climbed. Hattie stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, scanning the valley floor. No riders, no dust trails, only the hush of a land pretending to be still. Inside, Silas stirred awake from where he'd slumped by the fire. He pushed upright ribs, protesting, but less sharply than the day before. He had expected the night to bring nightmares, but instead it brought something stranger, dreams of holding steady, of firing true beside the woman who had refused to let him die. He found her crouched by the barn, repairing the bullet-scored boards. She didn't look up when he approached, only spoke low. "They'll regroup." "I know." His voice was rough but steadier. "But we held them." Her hand paused briefly on the hammer, then resumed. "A fight isn't over because one round is done. It ends when one side is dust and the other walks away. Silas stood silent, watching her drive the nail, her shoulders taut beneath the sun-bleached shirt. She worked like a man, yet there was no mistaking the grace in her movements. Strength did not cancel her womanhood. It defined it differently, cut sharp by survival. "You could have left me there," he said finally. "Would been easier." She glanced at him, eyes flint but softened by a flicker of something else. Easier doesn't last. Right doesn't leave a man bleeding in the dirt. Her words lodged deep. He thought of the years he'd spent drifting job to job, watching decent folk crushed under lawless hands, telling himself it wasn't his fight. Now he realized maybe it always had been. By midday, Hattie saddled Ash. "I'm riding to town." Supplies. Ammunition. News. Silas shifted uneasily. "I'll go." "You can't ride 6 miles with ribs like that." "Then I'll walk," he muttered, jaw set. Her gaze pinned him. "You'd collapse halfway, and I don't drag dead weight." "I won't be dead," he said, sharper than he intended. "I won't sit here while you face all of it alone." The air between them tightened. Hattie studied him a long moment, then finally said, "Fine. But if you fall, I leave you where you drop. Understand?" He nodded, though he knew she wouldn't. They set out late afternoon, Ash bearing the bulk of their weight. Silas gritted through the pain, jaw clenched, but pride kept him upright. Hattie didn't coddle. She simply set the pace, eyes ever forward. Green River Station shimmered in the valley below as dusk bled the sky crimson. A huddle of buildings, saloon, mercantile smithy, and the squat telegraph shack that brought the world's lies into the frontier. The moment they rode in, Silas felt eyes on them. Conversations dulled. A pair of ranch hands nudged each other at the sight of Hattie leading the stranger through town. Her reputation was written in every whisper, the woman with the Colt, the one who shot quicker than most men dared draw. They tied Ash at the hitching post outside the mercantile. Inside, the clerk raised a brow, but said nothing as Hattie laid coin on the counter. Powder lead flour beans. 2 sacks. While she checked the goods, Silas wandered near the notice board. A sheet of cheap paper tacked crooked caught his eye. His name, Silas O'Doyle, wanted for theft and fraud. His stomach twisted. He tore it down. "They're spreading it," he said tightly as she returned. "Making me the criminal." Hattie's eyes narrowed on the paper. "That's how they do it. If they can't kill your body, they kill your name." Then what? His voice cracked between anger and despair. "Even if we fight them off, I'll never be more than an outlaw on paper." She folded the sheet and slipped it into her coat. "Paper burns." Before he could answer, the door banged open. 3 men strode in dusty coats, hands heavy near their holsters. Black Knoll's mark was all over them. "Well, well," one drawled. "The stray dog and the woman with the iron hand." His eyes raked Hattie with mockery. "Heard tell you think you can fight off the whole knoll." Hattie's stance didn't shift, though Silas saw her fingers twitch once near her revolver. "I don't think," she said coolly. "I shoot." The man's smile faltered. Tension coiled like a rattler ready to strike. The clerk froze behind the counter, eyes darting. Then Silas stepped forward, surprising even himself. "You'll have to shoot me first," he said, voice raw but steady. "Because I won't run." "Not anymore." For a moment, The room held its breath. The leader sneered, but his hands stayed still. "Not today," he muttered. "Orders say to wait. Enjoy your last night breathing." With that, they turned and left spurs jangling. The clerk exhaled shakily. "You two best ride out quick. Trouble's coming." Outside, the street was quiet, but the threat hung thicker than dust. Silas's hands trembled from the confrontation, though his face stayed firm. Hattie looked at him, long unreadable. Then she said, "Maybe you're worth the bullets after all." They rode home under a bruised sky. The first stars pricked through as coyotes howled in the distance. Silas clutched the sack of supplies, but more than beans and powder weighed on him. For the first time in years, he felt the stir of something like belonging. At the ranch, they unpacked in silence. Hattie lit the lamp shadows, stretching across the cabin walls. Silas laid the sacks down, then turned. "I meant it," he said. "What I told them. I won't run." Her gaze softened just enough to make his chest ache. "Then stand steady. Because the next fight will be harder." He nodded. "With you, I will." For a heartbeat, neither moved. The lamplight flickered their shadows, close, almost touching. Then Hattie looked away, breaking the spell. "Get some sleep," she said, voice clipped again. "Tomorrow we'll start building defenses." Silas lay on the pallet once more, but this time the silence didn't feel empty. He listened to her steady steps, the sound of her settling in the chair by the window rifle across her lap. Watching, guarding, not just the land, but perhaps in some way him too. And in the darkness before dawn, with wolves howling at the ridge, Silas O'Doyle realized something he'd never dared hope a man could be saved, not by mercy, but by a woman fierce enough to claim his life as worth protecting. The following dawn broke red over the ridges, casting the valley in the color of blood. Hattie stood at the porch rail, arms folded, watching the light spill. Behind her, Silas stirred from the pallet. His body still ached, but the bruises were fading, and the pain was dulled now by a new fire inside him, the need to prove himself worthy of standing at her side. Hattie turned when she heard him shift. "Eat," she said, nodding to the skillet of beans warming on the stove. "You'll need strength." Silas limped to the table, spooned some beans onto a tin plate. Strength for what? Fencing, trenches, sightlines. Her tone was matter-of-fact, like she was listing off chores. "If they come again, and they will, I don't plan to make it easy for them." He swallowed a bite, then asked carefully, "How long have you been fighting them?" Hattie leaned against the post, gaze fixed on the far horizon. "Since the spring after my father died. They came sniffing, then trying to claim this land as unworked. I shot their scout clean through the hat. They've been circling ever since, waiting for me to weaken." "And you never did," Silas said softly. She turned, meeting his eyes, and for a moment he saw the truth behind her steel. "I almost did. More times than I'll admit. But a woman alone doesn't get the right to fall." Her words struck him deep. He set down his spoon. "You're not alone now." She studied him, her expression unreadable, before finally nodding once. "We'll see if you prove it." The day became a blur of work. Hattie showed him how to dig shallow trenches along the north fence line, where a rifleman could drop low unseen. She had him drag logs into place, stacking them into a crude barricade. His ribs screamed, his back burned, but he gritted through it. Each time he faltered, She was there, not with pity, but with that silent measuring look that demanded he rise again. By mid-afternoon, sweat darkened his shirt, his hands blistered raw. He sank onto the fence rail chest, heaving. "I don't know if I can keep pace with you." Hattie crouched opposite, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. "You don't have to keep pace. Just keep standing." The words steadied him more than rest. He rose, took up the shovel again. As dusk drew near, they sat side by side on the porch, drinking water from tin cups. The valley stretched quiet, the sky painted in violet and gold. For a rare moment, the silence between them wasn't heavy, it was almost companionable. Silas broke it first. "When they come again, it'll be worse. You said yourself they'll send more." "They'll send their best," Hattie replied. Her gaze didn't waver from the horizon. "Gun hands who've killed before. Men who won't spook easy." He gripped his cup knuckles white. "And if they take me, if I drag you down." Her eyes slid to him, sharp but calm. "Then I'll shoot every last one of them and take you back. You're under my roof now. That makes you mine to guard." Something in her voice, a raw edge beneath the iron, made his chest tighten. He nodded, once words sticking in his throat. Night came cool, the stars brilliant. They kept lanterns, low rifles within reach. Hattie slept little, listening to the wind. Silas lay awake too, staring at the rafters, the weight of her promise heavy in his mind. No one had ever claimed him like that before, not with possession, but with fierce protection. The next morning, as they checked the herd at the creek, the sound of distant hooves reached them. Not a herd. Riders. Many. Hattie's eyes narrowed. She spurred Ash up the rise, Silas stumbling after. From the ridge dust plumed on the southern trail. At least a dozen men. "They're coming," he said, throat dry. "Sooner than I thought," Hattie muttered. She turned, Ash eyes already calculating. "We hold them at the creek bend. Narrow ground. They can't fan wide there." "You mean to fight them all?" Her look silenced him. "I mean to make them regret crossing me." Back at the cabin, they prepared fast. Ammunition stacked on the table, water flasks, filled rifles loaded. Hattie strapped on a second revolver, the leather snug on her thigh. She tossed Silas a shorter rifle. "Stay behind cover. Aim low and steady. Don't waste shots." He nodded, though fear churned his gut. As the sun climbed, the sound of riders grew louder. The ground trembled with the approach. Hattie and Silas crouched behind the barricade at the creek bend, hearts hammering. The first rider appeared, then another, then the whole pack, dusty, armed faces hard with intent. At their head rode a man broad as a bull, a scar cutting down his cheek. His voice carried over the rush of hooves. "Hattie Norwood, you've meddled long enough. Hand over the man, and we'll spare your hide." Hattie rose, rifle steady, her silhouette sharp against the glare. "You want him? You'll have to ride through me." The scarred man sneered. "Then you die with him." He lifted his arm, and the riders surged forward. Gunfire erupted, echoing off the canyon walls. Hattie's rifle cracked, dropping the lead horse in its tracks, sending the rider tumbling. Silas fired the recoil, slamming his bruised shoulder, but his bullet caught another man's leg, toppling him into the dirt. The creek bend filled with chaos, horses, screaming men, shouting, bullets snapping. Hattie moved with deadly precision, reloading, smooth as breath firing without waste. Silas clung to her training sighting, low steadying his breath. Twice he missed, but twice more he struck true. Yet the riders pressed hard, numbers closing. Splinters flew from the barricade as bullets tore through. Silas ducked, low heart racing. He thought of running, of hiding, but then he saw her. Hattie, standing tall, revolvers blazing, her hat blown back, her hair wild in the sun. She fought like the land itself, unyielding, relentless. Something surged in him, then burning away fear. He rose, fired again, and shouted hoarse into the storm, "You won't take her land." The cry seemed to echo stronger than his own voice. Hattie glanced at him once, just a flicker, but it was enough. She grinned, a fierce, wild grin, and turned back to the fight. When the smoke cleared, the ground was littered with groaning men and scattered horses. The scarred leader had fled with the remnants, dust trailing after. Silas leaned against the barricade chest, heaving rifle trembling in his hands. He looked at Hattie. She was breathing hard, face streaked with dust and sweat, but her eyes burned bright. "You held," she said simply. He swallowed, nodding. "Because you taught me." For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the creek's murmur and the moans of the beaten men. Then Hattie holstered her revolver, stepped closer, and clapped his shoulder. "From now on," she said, voice low, "this fight isn't mine alone. It's ours." Silas met her gaze steady now. "Then I'll stand with you, as long as it takes." And in that battered canyon, with smoke still rising and the smell of gunpowder thick in the air, a bond was sealed, not of debt nor of mercy, but of fire and choice. They buried no one and blessed nothing. Hattie wasn't in the business of elegies. She bound the living where they lay, took their sidearms, slit girths, so no man could mount in a hurry, and sent the least wounded riding double with a message, "Tell Black Knoll, the creek still runs and the woman still stands." The man didn't argue. He wheeled his horse and fled like a leaf in wind. When the last groan faded into distance, silence rolled in thick as smoke. The barricade at the bend looked like a beaver's dam after flood-splintered logs, churned mud brass, winking in the grit. Silas leaned both hands on the top rail, the tremor in his arms slow to leave. Hattie wiped her revolver with a rag eyes, traveling the ridgelines, listening for a second wave that didn't come. "Drink." She handed him the gourd. He swallowed and coughed on the first pull. She waited, then said, "You held the line." "I only shot because you stood," he answered, voice raw. Her mouth made the smallest motion, a half-smile that didn't quite claim her lips. "Standing's contagious if you let it be." They worked until sunfall, dragging the fallen aside, kicking the worst of the debris into the ditch, tamping fresh earth over the most blood-soaked patches. When the light finally went blue, they walked back to the house without speaking. Ash nosed Hattie's shoulder at the corral, as if counting heads and finding two where there'd been two. Hattie rested her cheek briefly against the mare's neck. It was the closest thing to tenderness she allowed herself outdoors. Inside, the lamp cast a warm circle over the table. Hattie set beans to warming, tore a heel of bread poured chicory black. Silas lowered himself onto the bench, the ache in his ribs a dull drum. He watched her move, economical, precise, as if every gesture had been measured against waste and found exact. "You could have sent me away," he said at last, "before this started." "I could have." She slid a bowl to him. But a thing you send away doesn't stop following you. Might as well face it where the ground knows your boots. He chewed, swallowed. I used to think the ground never wanted me. Every place I set my name, someone took it. Papers, lies, guns. Paper burns, she said again, as if the words were a stone she'd tested with her tongue and found solid. He looked down at his hands, blistered, nicked, cracked lines inked with powder. What made you start fighting, if you don't mind the question? Hattie took her time answering. She wiped the rim of the pot with the rag, set the lid, leaned her hip to the table's edge. A man once told me everything on this land belonged to men with bigger names and longer shadows. That I'd do better learning to live small. Her gaze lifted to him flat and bright. I don't live small. Not for him. Not for anyone. Silas swallowed against the thickness in his throat. Then I won't either. She held his eyes a heartbeat, then nodded. Good. They rode to town at first light. Not because they wanted to, but because bullets don't grow on sage and news travels better than guesses. Green River Station sat awake and watchful when they clattered in. The smith worked his bellows too hard. Men on porches pretended to read papers they never bought. The wind had a taste of storm, though the sky was clean. Inside the mercantile, the same clerk bagged flour and lead with hands that shook less than the day before. Word says Knoll's hiring special, he muttered, eyes flicking to the door. A gun called Raleigh Kane. Shoots as if he's got a clock where his heart should be. Hattie counted coin into his palm. When telegram put him 2 days out riding light. He hesitated. You could go to the marshal. Hattie's laugh was one breath without humor. The marshal's pockets got a boss. As if conjured, a boot scraped the doorway. A deputy filled it star-dull with dust hat brim, shadowing small eyes that enjoyed power more than duty. Norwood, he said, letting the name roll against his tongue. And O'Doyle. His gaze snagged on Silas. There's a bill on you. Hattie stepped half a pace, and suddenly there was no room in the world for any hand to reach a gun that wasn't hers. There's a bill filled with lies, she said. You aimed to make a mistake in front of witnesses, deputy. A hitch of thought crossed his face. Not fear, calculation. Then he tipped his hat 2 millimeters. Keep your war on your side of the fence, he said, and pushed out into the light. Starnails, the clerk whispered when the deputy's boots hit the dust. He's the only man in the valley wears 'em. Hattie's gaze cut to Silas, once quick as a hawk's pass. He read it, file away the detail. Nails like stars. A mark in dirt worth remembering. They left town with sacks tight and eyes tighter. On the ridge above the ranch, Hattie dismounted and scanned the rib of hills where the creek took its first turn. Silence. But her skin prickled at the wrongness of it. They spent the afternoon turning wrong toward less wrong. Hattie strung wire where the fence had gaped, set 2 trip lines a man could only find if he crawled, filled a pair of stoneware jugs with lamp oil, and set them under the porch where a quick hand could reach. Silas cut stakes and planted them where sage would hide their tops, measured sight lines to the cottonwoods, and at Hattie's instruction buried a small crate at the north corner of the barn, a last resort box with cartridges and a canteen, and 2 matches waxed against rain. They slept in shifts. Around midnight, the wind changed. It brought the smell of pitch and the faint hiss that isn't quite river and isn't quite whisper. Hattie sat upright before the first arrow thudded into the barn roof and bloomed a nasty little flower of flame. Fire Silas was already moving, hauling the bucket he'd filled that afternoon, heaving water up, down, up again. Hattie shot the next arrow out of air once, twice dropped prone, and sent 2 rounds into the darker dark where a man thought crouch made him a rock. The crouch moved no more. More arrows came, fewer than she expected. Test, not siege. The flames guttered, then died, leaving the barn roof spitting sparks into cold air. The hush after burned ears as much as the fire had. They probed, Silas said, breath fogging, to mark our answer. And to mark our water, Hattie replied, eyes turned toward the black shape of hills. They'll go for the head gate. At dawn, they rode up the cut where the creek was young and narrow. The air was sweeter there, less dust, more pine. A jay scolded them, then fled. Hattie dismounted first, crouched low. Boot prints, she murmured. Deep heel, wide toe, and Starnail Silas finished pointing at the crisp little notches in the damp clay. Once you knew the sign, it shouted. They rounded the last bend and found the head gate jammed with brush. Not drift, laid by hands. A burlap sack bled a milky thread into the current. Hattie stepped down, slashed it open. Lye fumes bit the back of her throat. They want the herd down with burns from the inside, she said. They poisoned the source, and no bullet need fire. Silas swore low, a word he hadn't used since a boy. Together they hauled brush free, heaved the stinking sack onto the bank-kicked fresh channels with their boots until the water ran clearer. Silas stumbled once, caught himself on a rock, and saw then what Hattie did not, while she wrestled the last clog, a stub of fuse tucked under a rotten log, hissing soft as a snake in sleep. Hattie, he dove, grabbed her arm, yanked. Time snapped. She didn't ask. She moved, shoving him ahead, throwing both their bodies down the cut, just as the log jumped its skin and became sound. The world cracked. Water leapt like a beast. Stones became teeth. They tumbled under, over limbs, and breath torn apart and slammed together again. When the rush let them go, they lay in the shallow, coughing up a river that hadn't wanted to be drunk. Silas rolled, found her by the flood-wet braid and the stubborn set of her jaw, still etched even in shock. Hattie. She propped on an elbow, spit, mud-wiped water from her eyes with the back of her wrist. You see it in time. Only just. She nodded once, as if the river had only confirmed her math. Kane's here, she said through grit, or someone mean enough to be worth his wages. They sat there a moment, soaked and breathing the creek chattering around their boots, as if it hadn't just tried to kill them. Above, somewhere in the scrim of pines, a crow called twice, counting or warning. Hattie pushed to her feet, pain a white line under her ribs, and offered a hand. He took it. For a heartbeat, neither let go. Back to the ranch, she said, voice low. We set for a duel he thinks is his. And make it yours, Silas said. Her eyes lifted to the ridge where the wind was already erasing star nail prints. Ours, she corrected, and for the first time since he'd met her, the word felt like shelter. The ride back to the ranch was slow, both horses heavy with water, still clinging to their coats, both riders stiff from the pounding of the creek. The land wore a strange hush, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for the next strike. Hattie sat tall in the saddle despite the bruises rising under her ribs, her eyes forever scanning the ridges. Silas rode beside her, jaw clenched, still tasting grit in his teeth. By the time the cabin came into view, the sun had burned through the mist and cast the valley in merciless gold. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, and the fences stood whole, but the quiet felt wrong, like a room that had been entered while its owner was away. Hattie slid from the saddle and signaled Silas to hold. She crouched low, eyes sweeping the ground. Hoof prints. Heavy. Fresh. A half-dozen riders, at least, had circled the place close enough to count windows, then peeled off. "They're watching us," Silas said, his voice tight. "Let them watch." Hattie's hand brushed the butt of her Colt. "We'll show them what's waiting." Inside the cabin smelled of smoke and iron. They stripped off wet coats and stoked the fire-drying powder in cleaning rifles, with hands still trembling from the river's fury. Hattie spread maps on the table, rough sketches of the valley she had drawn over years of patrols. Her finger traced the gullies, the ridgelines, the narrow paths where one gun could hold off three. "They'll come tonight," she said. "Kane won't waste daylight stalking. He'll use the dark." Silas leaned on the table, studying her face. "Tell me about him." "Kane," she spat the name like a burr. "Raleigh Kane. Ex-Union scout, turned killer for hire. They say he times his shots to a pocket watch, never off by a breath. He's not sloppy like Knoll's men. He'll come straight clean fast. And you've faced his kind before." Hattie's eyes narrowed, the lamplight catching in them like flint. "I've faced worse. But Kane's a shadow that doesn't spook. You'll need to be steady." Silas exhaled slowly, his ribs aching with the weight of it. "I will." Evening fell hard. The last light bled away, and the valley turned silver with moon. Hattie led Silas outside, positioning him behind the barricade at the creek bend, the same place they had held before. She crouched beside him, her revolver balanced in her hands like it belonged to her bones. Hours passed. The cold bit deep. Coyotes yipped far off. Silas fought the urge to nod off, jerking awake each time his head dipped. Hattie never moved, her eyes fixed on the ridge, as if she could see through stone. Then the night cracked, a single rifle shot, distant, sharp. A bullet hissed past and split the bark inches from Silas's head. He ducked, low heart hammering. "Down, Hattie," barked. They slid behind the barricade as another shot rang, this one deliberate, placed. Not random fire. Kane was probing, measuring their nerves. Silas clenched his rifle, scanning the darkness. "Where?" "High Ridge East," Hattie whispered. "He's ranging us." "How do you know?" "Because I'd do the same." Another crack. The bullet tore a chip from the barricade so precise it might have been laid with a chisel. Silas's breath came fast. "He's toying with us." Hattie's jaw flexed. "He wants me to move. He thinks fear makes a woman flinch." She leaned close, her voice a rough whisper. "But we're not moving. Not yet." Minutes dragged like hours. Kane fired again, each shot closer until the board shook with splinters. Silas felt sweat run cold down his spine despite the frost. Finally, silence. No shot. No sound. The waiting was worse than the bullets. Then a whistle. A signal. From the dark road shadows, half a dozen men, rifles spitting fire. Now Hattie shouted. She rose from cover, revolvers blazing. Silas fired wild, then steadier, hitting one rider clean in the shoulder. Another toppled screaming. But Cain wasn't among them. These were decoys meant to draw fire. The realization struck too late. A single shot cracked from the ridge, and Hattie's hat flew off her head, the bullet clipping hair clean. "Damn," she hissed, dropping low. Her eyes blazed. "He's good." Silas gripped her arm, voice hoarse. "You can't fight him like this. He's picking us apart." She shoved his hand off. "Then we changed the game." When the smoke thinned, the riders fled, leaving groans behind. Silence returned heavy, but Cain did not fire again. Back inside, Silas slammed the door, rage boiling in his chest. "He nearly killed you." Hattie sat at the table, reloading, calm as stone. "Nearly doesn't count." He paced, fists tight. "You talk like it doesn't matter. Like your life's just another round in the chamber." Her gaze snapped up hard as steel. "My life is another round. And I'll fire it till it's spent." Silas froze the words, striking him like a blow. For a moment he saw the weight she carried years alone, fighting shadows no one else dared face. She wasn't reckless. She was resigned. And he couldn't bear it. "No," he said, voice breaking. "Not anymore. You're not alone now. You hear me? If you go down, I go down. That's the truth." Her eyes searched his face, testing, measuring. Then something shifted, a crack in the armor, small but real. She looked away, first sliding bullets into the cylinder. "Then stand ready," she said softly. "Because Cain will come close next time. He has to. And when he does, we end this." Outside, the night deepened, the stars hard and cold. In the dark hills, somewhere unseen, Raleigh Cain wound his watch and smiled. Dawn broke pale, the sky washed in thin streaks of rose. The ranch was too quiet, as though every living thing knew a hunter waited in the hills. Hattie stood on the porch, revolvers belted, tight, eyes locked on the eastern ridge. She had not slept. Her shoulders carried the stillness of someone who knew the next hours would test every bone in her body. Silas came out behind her, rifle cradled in his arms. His face bore shadows from a night without rest, but there was no tremor in his grip now. "He's still out there," he said. Hattie nodded. "Cain doesn't leave a job undone." They spent the morning tightening defenses. Hattie walked the perimeter, setting fresh traps where the sage was thick. Silas stacked more logs by the porch, each one a shield if bullets came close. They worked without wasted words, every sound of hammer or shovel echoing in the hollow silence. By midday, the valley seemed to hum. Even the breeze through the grass carried tension. Silas paused by the corral, wiping sweat from his brow. If Cain's as good as they say, he stopped, his throat closing. Hattie turned, eyes sharp. "If you've got fear, spit it out. Don't swallow it." He exhaled. "If he takes you, I don't know if I'll stand after." Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Then don't let him take me." They ate little at noon, just dried meat and coffee gone bitter in the pot, after Hattie opened a small wooden box from the shelf. Inside lay a silver brooch tarnished by years. She fastened it to her vest with hands that didn't shake. Silas watched, curious. "My mother's," she said quietly. She wore it when she rode into town, said it made her feel harder to miss. I reckon I'll borrow that today." Afternoon stretched long. The heat bore down heavy, and the dust shimmered on the horizon. Then came the sound, the measured beat of hooves, not hurried, not careless. Deliberate. A rider approaching alone. Hattie straightened, squinting into the glare. The figure emerged slow, a tall man on a dark bay horse coat, black hat brim low. His posture was unnervingly calm, as if the valley already belonged to him. Silas's gut nodded. "Kane." Hattie touched his arm. "Stay sharp. But this part's mine." The rider stopped 50 yards out, swinging down with the grace of long habit. He tipped his hat, revealing a lean face carved by years and lit by cold eyes. A silver watch chain gleamed against his vest. "Hattie Norwood," he called, voice smooth as oiled leather. "They pay me heavy to put you down. You could make it easy. Step aside, hand over the man." Hattie's voice carried clear across the still air. "Not a chance." Kane smiled thin. "Then we do it the old way." He drew a revolver with measured ease, spinning it once before letting it rest in his hand. He looked at Silas. "You best hide, boy. This ain't your fight." But Silas stepped forward, rifle raised. "It is now." Kane's smile widened. "So be it." The standoff thickened. The sun dipped shadows, stretching long. Dust swirled at their boots. Silas's breath came shallow, his heart pounding so loud he thought Kane might hear it. Hattie's voice cut through. "Raleigh Kane, you time your shots to a watch. I hear it tick from here." Kane's brow twitched just barely. "It keeps me honest, or it makes you predictable." Her words struck like flint on steel. Kane's jaw tightened. He flicked the watch open, glancing at the second hand as though to steady himself. In that blink, Hattie moved. Her revolver cleared leather in a blur, the shot cracking like lightning. Kane staggered his gun, clattering to the dirt. But he wasn't finished. He drew his second revolver from behind his back, firing wild. A bullet grazed Hattie's arm, another split the porch post. Silas shouted, raising his rifle. He fired the shot, tearing Kane's hat from his head. Kane snarled, spun, and fired back. The bullet slammed into Silas's shoulder, spinning him to the ground. "Hattie," he gasped. She didn't falter. She advanced, eyes locked on Kane's revolver, steady despite the blood dripping from her sleeve. Kane raised his pistol again, but she was faster. Her shot struck home clean through his chest. He staggered once, twice, then collapsed into the dust. The silver watch tumbled from his vest, ticking faintly in the dirt before falling silent. The valley went still. No wind. No cry. Only the ragged breathing of the living. Hattie lowered her gun, chest heaving. She strode to Silas, dropping to her knees. His shirt was soaked red, but his eyes were open, fierce with pain. "You stood," she said softly, pressing her hand to his wound. "You taught me," he rasped, trying to smile. Her hand lingered on his chest, not just to stop the bleeding, but as if anchoring him to the earth itself. She looked back once at Kane's body, then forward again at Silas. "This land's ours now," she said, voice low, fierce, certain. And for the first time, Silas believed it. The body of Raleigh Kane lay sprawled in the dust, the silver watch still glinting faintly where it had fallen. The ticking had stopped, but the echo of his legend lingered in the stillness, a reminder of how close death had come. Hattie didn't spare him another glance. She pressed her palm hard against Silas's shoulder, feeling the hot flow of blood beneath her fingers. He gritted his teeth jaw, locked against the pain. "Stay with me," she said, her voice rough but steady. "I'm not going anywhere," he managed, forcing a half-smile, even as his lips went pale. She tore a strip from her shirt with quick efficiency, binding the wound tight. When the bleeding slowed, she hauled him to his feet with surprising strength. Silas swayed, but didn't fall. "You shot Cain," he whispered, disbelief mingled with awe. "I told you." She hooked his arm over her shoulders, steadying him as they moved toward the cabin. "This fight was ours." Inside, she eased him into the chair by the fire. He winced as she peeled away the bloody cloth, cleaned the wound with whiskey, and stitched it closed with thread, finer than her calloused fingers were used to. His breath hissed through his teeth, but he never looked away from her face. "You've done this before," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Too many times." She tied the last knot and sat back, wiping sweat from her brow. But never for someone who mattered. Silas blinked at her, the words cutting deeper than the needle had. For a moment, he had no reply, only the thudding of his heart to fill the silence. By nightfall, Cain's body was gone. Hattie had dragged it beyond the ridge, leaving the coyotes and the desert to do what they would. She buried the silver watch under a stone at the creek bend, marking the spot with nothing but memory. Silas watched her from the porch, his arm bound tight against his chest. "You're not afraid they'll come looking for him?" "They'll know soon enough," Hattie said, dusting her hands on her trousers. "Black Knoll doesn't leave debts uncounted. When word reaches them that Cain fell, they'll come heavy." But she turned eyes, catching his "a legend dying here" means something. "It'll make some think twice." Silas swallowed his throat dry. "And the ones who don't think twice." Her jaw set. "Then they'll bleed the same." For the next days, they worked like the earth itself demanded it. Hattie trained him harder, teaching him to shoot left-handed, while his right heeled to read shadows at dusk, to walk quiet over dry grass. Silas bore it all each lesson, burning away the man who once drifted and leaving behind someone tougher, steadier. At night, they sat by the fire, the silence between them softer now. She would oil her revolvers, and he would carve small figures from scrap pine horses, foxes, a hawk with wings outstretched. One evening, he held out the hawk, its lines rough but true. "For you," he said. She studied it a long time, then closed her hand around it. "Why a hawk?" "Because you never blink when the storm comes." Her throat worked, but she said nothing more. She simply set the hawk on the mantel beside the fire, where its wooden eyes caught the glow. The land itself seemed to shift with them. The cattle grew restless. Less often the creek ran clearer, and the nights, though still cold, felt less like a waiting grave. Silas began to believe, truly believe, that maybe there was life worth building here. But one evening, as the sky burned with sunset, a rider appeared on the far ridge. He carried no banner, but the dust behind him spoke of more. A scout. Hattie's hand went to her revolver, though she didn't draw. "Knoll knows," she murmured. The rider didn't come closer. He only reined in, watching the ranch a long moment, then wheeled his horse and vanished into the dusk. Silas exhaled slowly. "How long before they come?" "Not long." She turned to him, her face unreadable. "Cain was just the beginning. Knoll will bring more." Men who want the glory of finishing what Cain couldn't. And when they come, he asked, though he already knew her answer. Her eyes burned in the fading light. We meet them in the open. Together. He reached for her hand, then bowled certain. She didn't pull away. Their fingers locked, calloused and strong, two lives hardened by loss, now bound by choice. You saved me, he said quietly. But I think you saved yourself too. She looked at him long, then gave the smallest nod. Maybe we saved each other. The night that followed was calm, but both knew it was the stillness before storm. Black Knoll's shadow stretched long, and their love, though new and fragile, would soon face its greatest test. Yet for that moment, as they sat together under the wide western sky, their hands entwined, there was no fear, only the steady beat of two hearts that had finally found home. The warning came 3 days later. A hawk wheeled over the southern ridge, its cry sharp, startled. Hattie stood from the corral, where she had been tightening a girth, and shaded her eyes. Dust rose in the distance, a heavy plume, not from one rider, but many. They're coming, she said flatly. Silas stepped to her side, his shoulders still bound, but his rifle steady in his good hand. He didn't ask how many. The land itself answered the rumble of hooves, the faint metallic clink of gear carrying on the wind. By the time the first riders crested the rise, the valley was humming with their approach. 24 at least. Men in dust-stained coats, rifles bristling the black crest of Knoll's brand painted crude on saddle blankets. At their head rode a man broader than most, his beard streaked gray, his eyes flat as stone. That's Darius Knoll, Hattie murmured. Silas's jaw tightened. The devil himself. The riders spread wide, circling slow, hemming, the ranch like wolves tightening on wounded prey. Knoll raised a hand, and the horses stilled. His voice boomed across the valley. Hattie Norwood, you cost me good men. You took Cain. Now you hand over the drifter and the land, or I'll burn this place until even the coyotes won't sniff at it. Hattie stepped forward, revolver low at her hip, her stance unshaken. You think fear will loosen my grip, Knoll? This land is mine. Always was. Always will be. Knoll's laugh was harsh. Then you'll die with it. The standoff broke in a storm of gunfire. Bullets tore splinters from the porch rails, spat dust from the corral fence. Hattie moved like lightning, dropping to one knee and firing in smooth, measured rhythm. Each shot was precise. One man toppled from the saddle, another's hat flew spinning into the dirt. Silas stayed behind cover, aiming deliberate, his breath steady, as she had taught him. He struck a rider's thigh, sent another's horse shrieking sideways. Every pull of the trigger burned his shoulder, but he refused to stop. Knoll's men pushed hard, circling tighter. Two dismounted, crawling through the grass toward the barn. Hattie saw them first, spun, and sent them scrambling back with a pair of sharp shots. Barn Silas shouted, seeing movement at the far wall. A torch arched through the air, landing against the haystack. Flames licked fast, greedy. Hattie cursed, sprinting low across open ground. Bullets chased her heels, but she dove into the barn, hauling the torch out with bare hands and stamping it into the dirt until it smoldered dead. Smoke filled her lungs, but the barn stood. When she staggered back into daylight, Silas's heart nearly gave way. "You're mad," he shouted, half in awe, half in terror. "Mad keeps the herd alive," she shot back, taking cover beside him again. The battle raged on. The barricades they'd built bought them precious minutes, slowing the riders' charge. Men toppled horses reared the air thick with smoke and powder. Yet still Knoll sat his horse at the center, untouched, directing with cold precision. At last he lifted a horn to his lips and blew. The sound cut sharp, commanding. His men began to pull back, regrouping on the ridge. Silas frowned, chest heaving. They're retreating. No, Hattie said darkly, eyes narrowing. They're resetting. Knoll's voice carried again. You fight hard, Norwood, but I've got more men, more fire, and more years than you've got bullets. I'll be back at sundown, and when I come, the land burns. With that, he wheeled his horse and led the column away, dust swallowing them, until the valley fell silent again. Hattie leaned her hands on her knees, catching breath. Her sleeve was torn, streaked with soot. Silas gripped his rifle tighter. He means it, Silas, said voice hoarse. He'll torch everything. Hattie's eyes met his sharp and fierce. Then we don't wait for him to come. We take the fight to him. Silas blinked. Ride into his camp. Her nod was curt. Before sundown. Hit them where they gather, scatter the herd before they can set it against us. If we let him choose the ground, we're finished. Silas's pulse hammered. It was madness, yet it was the only way. He looked at her, this woman who had carried him, taught him, fought beside him, and found his answer already waiting in his chest. Then I ride with you, he said. She studied him, a long beat, the corners of her mouth twitching into that half grin again. Good, because it's us against all of them now. They set to work fast, reloading, gathering every flask of oil, every round of ammunition. Hattie packed a bundle of dynamite sticks she'd kept buried in the shed, relics from her father's mining days. She tied them behind the saddle as if securing a bedroll. Silas raised a brow, planning to scare them. Her eyes burned, planning to end them. By the time the sun dipped low, they were mounted, riding hard toward the southern ridge where Knoll's men had vanished. The sky bled red shadows stretching long over the valley. Ahead, faint smoke curled where fires had been lit Knoll's camp. Silas's heart pounded with every hoofbeat. He glanced at Hattie, riding tall, her face set like stone, her braid whipping in the wind. She looked like a figure out of legend, half woman, half fury, carved from the dust of the West. Whatever happens, he said, voice rough, I'm proud I found you here. Her eyes flicked to him, softer than he expected. You didn't find me, Silas. You stood with me. There's a difference. And as the campfires of Black Knoll's army came into view, the two of them rode side by side, ready to carve their love into history with gunpowder and flame. They reined in at the edge of a scrub-choked draw, the southern ridge rising like a broken tooth against the last red of the day. Below Black Knoll's camp, spread in a rough crescent picket lines, Cook fires a wagon with tarpaulin thrown over a mound-shaped too regular to be anything but powder kegs, and a corral jammed with stolen stock. Men moved in clumps, laughing, sharpening blades, taking swigs from bottles that made their courage louder and their aim worse. At the center sat a dark pavilion, its rope lines taut as fiddle strings. Darius Knoll's shadow passed once behind the canvas, long and slow, like a man who trusted that the world would keep tilting toward him just for breathing. Hattie slid from the saddle and handed Ash's reins to Silas. Her eyes didn't leave the tarpaulin wagon. "Powder first," she said. "Without teeth, their snarl is just wind." She unlashed the bundle of dynamite, the sticks wrapped in oiled cloth, the fuses waxed to keep the creek's memory from them. Silas checked the caps, his fingers steady despite the thud in his chest. "How close do we need to set?" he asked. "Close enough to whisper to their bones." The ghost of a grin touched her mouth and vanished. She pointed with her chin. "See those 3 pines, stacked like a crooked crown we belly to there. I'll crawl the rest. You watch the east flank. If anyone sees me, you sing to 'em with that rifle." Silas nodded. "And Knoll." Hattie's gaze slid to the pavilion, then back to him. "He'll come out when the ground starts to shake. He always wants to see what breaks." Her hand brushed the hawk he'd carved, which she'd tied at her belt as a charm. "When he does, we end it." They dropped into the draw and moved like shadows taught to walk. Sage scraped leather. A cricket misjudged their intent and chirped once, then thought better of it. From the camp came snatches of song, a rough harmony that pretended at brotherhood and ended at coin. A sentry turned his head at a sound that wasn't there, then went back to counting his pay before he had it. At the crooked crown of pines, Hattie flattened her body and slid forward on forearms. The dynamite clutched close. Silas settled behind a deadfall with a view of the powder wagon and the pavilion's front flap. He clicked the safety, then stopped himself. The rifle had no safety. That was for a different future with different guns. He breathed slow. In. 2. Out. 2. The way she'd taught him. Hattie reached the wagon's shadow. The tarpaulin smelled of resin and damp hemp. She could feel the shape of the barrels beneath the chill of powder sleeping in wood. She worked quick and blind, tucking 2 sticks deep under the tarp, pushing a third behind the rear wheel, where the axle would turn splinters into shrapnel. She measured fuse lengths with her mind, the crawl back, the run to the draw, the seconds between spark and judgment. A boot scraped gravel to her left. She froze. The boot lifted, set down again, the weight lazy, the walk uncurious. No patrol, just a man stumbling between bottle and bedroll. He didn't see her. He saw nothing that didn't already serve him. He passed on, humming a tune that died when he forgot its end. Hattie struck the first match. With her teeth cupped it, breathed life into a green fuse that caught slow, then sure. The second lit easier. The third whispered to fire, like they'd always known each other. She slid back, inch by inch, a snake that decided not to be stepped on today. A voice snapped from the pavilion, low, angry. Hattie rolled behind a crate and listened. Another voice answered higher, nervous. She knew that second voice. She'd heard it dirty up a doorway in town. The deputy. Starnail boots scuffed canvas. "I told you she'd stand," the deputy muttered. "I told you Kane wouldn't finish it without—" Kane's dead Knoll cut in the words flat as a fist. "And you brought me a name that cost good men and no land." A pause. "If you weren't wearing that tin, I'd have hobbled you to the picket line for luck." The deputy swallowed. Hattie's mouth went thin. Silas saw her shoulders tense from across the dark, felt the old anger like a heat in his own ribs. He settled his sights on the pavilion flap and waited for justice to dress itself as an accident. Hattie crawled the last yards back to the pines and pressed into the earth beside Silas. "Fuses lit," she whispered. "Count of 20, and the world forgets how to be quiet." Silas's lips moved soundless. He reached for her hand, found it squeezed once. She squeezed back hard. 1918. A sentry turned toward the powder wagon, eyes narrowing at a glow that hadn't been there a breath ago. "Hey," he began. 17. Hattie rose to a crouch Colt in her fist, eyes on the pavilion. 16:15. Silas tucked the stock into his shoulder and let the rifle become part of his breath. 14. The sentry shouted properly now. Two men lunged. One slapped at a fuse that didn't care about panic. 13. Knoll's shadow filled the pavilion opening. He stepped out big as his legend eyes sweeping the camp with the calm of a man who believed in his own gravity. The deputy came behind Star Nails, biting dust hand, hovering near a gun he didn't deserve. 12. Silas fired. The deputy's hat jumped and whirled into the firelight like a bad thought leaving a worse head. The deputy flinched backward, lost his balance, fell scrambled, grabbed for his belt, and found only fear. He scuttled behind a crate and stayed there. 11. Knoll didn't flinch. His gaze went straight to the powder wagon, then past it, into the dark, into the place where men hid behind dead wood and righteous anger. He didn't aim yet. He just looked and smiled. 10. "Norwood," he roared. "You think you can make me run?" 9. "I think I can make you choose," she said, stepping into the fire's edge silver brooch, throwing a hard star at her throat. 8. 3 fuses burned like stubborn snakes. 7. Knoll drew. Hattie drew. Time moved like syrup that had decided to be glass. Silas held his second shot and let the air tell him when. 6. Knoll fired first, the bullet taking Hattie's sleeve and a bite of her skin with it. She didn't blink. Her first round caught the pistol in his hand and broke it from his grip like a bad habit. 5. The sentries reached the wagon. One stamped a fuse out with his boot triumph bright on his face. 4. The second fuse kissed wood. 3. Silas shot the boot stamper through the calf. The man's leg buckled. His heel slid. The fuse winked at him and kept burning. 2. Knoll went for a second pistol at his back. Hattie put a bullet through the leather loop that held it, pinning it tight. He stared at her with something like respect and a promise of murder. 1. Hattie grabbed Silas by the collar and dove. The world stood up and unmade itself. The blast tore the camp in half. Fire leapt into a throat of black smoke. The powder barrels coughed their iron breath and flung splinters like locusts. Men and horses screamed. The corral gate shattered. Stock poured out like a river, finding the old course it missed. Flames licked rope canvas pride. The pavilion shrugged its skin and fell. Knoll didn't fall. He staggered, teeth bared, coat scorched eyes, hot with a rage that mistook pain for proof. He yanked a knife from his belt and stalked through the chaos toward Hattie, like a man walking into his own legend. Silas's ears rang high and cruel. He saw Knoll coming and lifted the rifle. The hammer dropped on emptiness. He reached for the next round and found none. He started forward anyway. "Stay," Hattie snapped, without looking, and stepped into Knoll's path. Up close, he smelled of smoke and fat and a life spent bending weaker spines. He feinted left with the knife, then came right quick for a big man. Hattie, slid back the blade, catching her vest scratching sparks. She answered with steel of her own, a short black-handled blade that had lived in her boot longer than some men had lived. The knives talked, and the old language scraped bite breath. Knoll pressed. Hattie yielded a step, then another, drawing him past a pile of fractured beams. Silas, vision tunneling, saw what she saw, a heartbeat late the fractured cart tongue, leaning at a mean angle length of chain still looped at one end. Hattie stepped left as Knoll lunged. His boot skidded on a smear of powder soot. He flailed, not a bull now, but just a large animal remembering gravity. Hattie planted her heel on the tongue shoved. Wood jumped. Chain swung up and wrapped his ankles like the punchline of a joke he'd told too long. He fell hard. The knife skittered. Reflex made him grab for it. Reflex ate his hand on splinters. Hattie kicked the blade away and stood over him, breath-sharp blood running warm down her arm. "You had your chance to leave this valley alone," she said. "You chose the wrong story." Knoll spat blood and something uglier. "I don't leave anything. I take—" "Not today." She leveled the Colt. Silas limped into the circle of light, the ring in his ears, fading to a bell he could almost ignore. "Hattie," he said, not a warning, not a plea, just her name, the first home he'd owned. She didn't look away from Knoll. "He won't stop if he breathes," she said. "And if you end him," Silas answered, voice low, "the next devil just wears his coat." He glanced around. The men who could still run were running. The ones who couldn't were crawling away from fire, away from her, away from the truth they didn't want to learn twice. The deputy peered from behind his crate, white as a sheep's belly starnails, catching firelight like tiny lies. Hattie's jaw worked. The Colt didn't waver. Then she holstered it slow. She grabbed the chain, yanked Knoll's ankles hard and fast, dragged him through cinders to the wreck of the pavilion pole. Silas seized the other end of the chain and looped it twice tight. Hattie leaned down, met Knoll's eyes with a steadiness that held no contempt, only verdict. "You can stand trial in a town where the marshal's pocket empties into your hand," she said. "Or you can rot under this pole and the coyotes can file their own papers. Choose." Knoll's chest heaved. Pride fought sense lost. "Trial?" he ground out. "I'll buy the judge. I'll buy the moon." "You'll buy nothing with your hands bound," Hattie said, "and word already left this camp with your men who can still ride." She straightened, turned, caught the deputy trying to slip like a weasel toward the dark. "Not you," she said, and shot the ground by his starnails. Dirt bit his face. He flattened, hands up. They worked fast in the ruined glow. Hattie cut loose the stock. Silas gathered guns into a heap. No hand would find whole by morning. They put ropes on Knoll and the deputy, bound side by side like a lesson that might finally stick. When the fire died to orange teeth, they mounted. Hattie swung into the saddle with a wince. She didn't dignify with a sound. Silas climbed stiffly, the world settling around his wound with each breath. Behind them, Knoll rode double on a trembling horse, wrists lashed to the horn, the deputy tied to a lead like a shamefaced mule. They rode into a new dawn. Smoke thinned. The ridge took the first light and threw it kindly down. At the creek bend, Hattie reined in and looked at the stone under which a silver watch slept without ticking. She touched the rock with 2 fingers, a salute not to Cain, but to endings that made room for other things. Silas turned in the saddle. The ranch lay quiet ahead, fences true roofs, whole the cottonwoods shaking off the night. He looked at her, at the set of her shoulders that had carried too many winters alone at the hawk on her belt, catching morning like a promise. "What now?" he asked. Hattie took a long breath that tasted like water without lie, like wind without smoke. "Now we take them to town and say the words that make men choose sides out loud," she said. "Now we put names on papers not to steal but to keep." She glanced at him, the corner of her mouth finally finding the shape of a smile that belonged to no one else. "Now we build fences. Heard. A place that answers when someone says our name." "Ours," Silas said. "Ours," she agreed. They nudged the horses forward, the prisoners pulling the future behind them like a cart that wouldn't ever roll quite the same. And as the sun lifted clean over the ridge, the valley didn't hold its breath anymore. It let it out slow and sure, like something that had decided to live.